It's been so long. An Adrienette fanfiction, part 32. Hey, is something bothering you? Said a soft voice. Adrian looked up to see Julika standing in front of him. Oh, hi Julika, he said with a smile. Kinda, he admitted, but not really. Do you want to talk about it? She asked. Adrian sighed. Maybe. I don't know. He really didn't know. He didn't know why he was feeling this way. For the first time in, well, all the time that he could possibly think of, his father had been willing to let him have an actual party, and seemingly wanted to be a bigger part of his life. Shouldn't he be just overwhelmingly happy about it? My father offered to give me an actual birthday party next week, and I don't know, it just feels weird. He also asked how my studies were going. Not just the usual, hey, are you passing everything, but it was like he actually wanted to hear about what I'd learned. He's never done that before, Adrian admitted. I should be happy about it, I know, but it just feels odd. I feel like, I shouldn't feel this way because I finally have my father as an active part of my life, and I don't think this makes sense. He sighed and leaned his head on both of his hands. Actually, I think that's pretty normal, Julika said with a kind smile. He looked at her with a perplexed expression. Really? She nodded. I think you're so used to him being more separate from your daily life. When he suddenly pops in, it's jarring. It's something new. I think anything new feels a little odd at first, their purple and black-haired girl said. Adrian tilted his head to the side. He hadn't thought of it like that. He had just always expected or thought that if his father started being more affectionate and more involved in his life, he'd just be over the moon and happy-go-lucky. This was just an unforeseen obstacle. I guess that kind of makes sense, Adrian said. Julika nodded a bit. Thank you for helping me, he said earnestly. She smiled a bit. Of course, I'll always listen if you need it. And I'll probably understand your situation a bit better than the rest of our friends, she said, smiling at him before getting up when she heard Rose calling for her. Adrian waved goodbye to her, again staying by himself at the table. Julika probably did understand better than the rest of their classmates. Her father, as far as he knew, he wasn't around a whole lot. Even less than his own father. Most everyone had a pretty positive relationship with their fathers. Julika and him were sort of like the outlaws. He'd never really asked about her family. The only things that he knew were the things he could gather from just being friends with her. Perhaps he could talk to her more about these family things. She was a very kind person. He knew that for sure. Quiet like him and clearly willing to listen. Why are you sitting by yourself? He was broken out of his reverie by another voice. It was Marinette. She smiled sweetly at him and slid into the seat next to him. He could almost hear his heartbeat speeding up. I was waiting for you guys, he replied. Thanks, she said with a slight laugh. You look a bit tired today. Bad night? She asked with a worried look. Adrian blinked a couple of times. Oh no, just clearing up a bit of the Lilac rumors took a lot longer than I thought, he said sheepishly. The tabloids were still going haywire, but surprisingly, his father didn't give him any grief about it. He'd expected a lecture about reputation, but nothing. Mostly he was just annoyed. It was just a big lie that really got things stirring. There were probably millions more articles refusing to believe that it was because of Namakuma and still was theorizing about the relationship. The only good thing that came out of the whole ordeal was that his classmates were finally becoming suspicious of Lila. Oh, that's not fun at all, Marinette said, with a frown. I'm guessing they still won't go away? He nodded. I wish I could help, but I know that the stories will never go away. They exist forever on the internet. Even the smallest things flare it up, she said in a tired tone of voice. Yeah, that's exactly what happens. I bet. I think there's still some scandal pictures of us from back when my perfume ad came out, he said with a laugh. Adrienette covered her face with her hands, but also laughed. Oh, God, please don't remind me, she said into her hands. I was in my pajamas. It was awful. Adrian knew that his cheeks were turning pink, and he was actually pretty glad that she wasn't looking at him. It was still a fun day for me, Adrienette pointed out. Me too, Adrienette admitted. It warmed his heart, and a smile grew on his face. Now he knew that she was just nervous because she had a crush on him back then, which that was something that still baffled him to this day. But back then, he really had thought that she didn't want to be around him, and he was just happy to hear that she wasn't miserable that day. You know what that kind of reminds me of? The day at the fair, Adrienette said. That day at the fair. That first day that his feelings for Adrienette had started changing. He just hadn't seen her in so long. It had stirred up something new inside of him. Or perhaps something that had always been there, but he just never bothered to really think about it. He tried not to wander down that path too far. Besides, what kind of fool didn't realize they liked someone? The sudden change of her being back was just jarring enough to let him notice her in a new way. Especially since she seemed a lot more comfortable around him. He got to see the real side of Adrienette that Chant Noir would see. The more playful, confident side. The side that drew everyone in and made their classmates smile. It was a great day, Adrian commented, hoping that the blush wasn't too prominent on his face or that Adrienette at the very least would just ignore it if she saw it. We should go back when it comes, she hummed. We could take another picture on the Ferris wheel and compare it to the old one, she laughed, nudging his side. He smiled. Yeah, we should, he said. A buzz coming from his phone caused them both to stare at it suddenly. Unsurprisingly and irritatingly, it was another story about the genuality of his so-called relationship with Lila. He sighed and put his head on the table and heard Adrienette scoff. They can never leave a person alone, can they? She muttered. This doesn't happen a lot to me, Adrian admitted. I'm usually not interesting enough to write love scandal articles about, he said, lifting his head and shyly looking at Adrienette. She laughed a bit. Well, you're the headline topic, so I think they find you a bit more interesting now, she joked. She gestured towards his phone with her hand. May I? She asked. Go ahead. Carefully, she picked up his phone and unlocked it. She typed on it quickly and pressed a few more buttons and then handed it right back to him. Adrian looked at her curiously and then back at his phone. What did you do? He asked, genuinely perplexed. Adrienette shrugged. Just wait, she said. Adrian stared at his phone, waiting for whatever to happen. And then came another story. Only this time it wasn't a notification. It was a banner that went away after a few seconds. Just long enough for him to read the clickbait title. Whoa, Adrian said, surprised. What'd you do? He asked with a grin. I changed the settings, Adrienette smiled, explaining what she did. Me and Aiden had to do that when we first started dating. There were a lot of stories about us. Me being a foreign designer and him being a model who only had short flings. We ended up being hot gossip for a while, she said, wincing. It clearly brought up some unsavory emotions for her. Adrian had to hold down the slight jealousy he got from hearing Aiden's name. It had been quite some time since the two had broken up. He wasn't sure why he still got that little flare-up. There was no reason to. For one, she knew that they were not going to get back together. Adrian hadn't pried into it, and he didn't exactly know what happened, but generally it was something about them not being what she wanted. And reason number 2, he was the guy sitting next to Marinette and in the same country. And 3, Aiden was a nice guy and there's no reason to be jealous or mad at him. Adrien had common sense. That makes sense, Adrien agreed. Marinette shrugged. Drama. It's always the smallest things that are really big. Adrien nodded enthusiastically, in agreement. A memory flashed into his mind. He wasn't quite sure why it did, but it did. It was one of that night where Marinette and him had watched the stars in the pitch black darkness and talked about the constellations. It would be a lie to say that that night wasn't one of the top 10 happiest days of his life. Adrien remembered seeing it just the previous night as he patrolled. I saw your rooftop on the building the other day, he blurted out without really thinking about it. Marinette looked at him surprised. Really? She asked. How? Adrien wanted to give himself a sarcastic pat on the back. It was totally off route to his house and school. Gorilla drove by it, he said. Marinette didn't question it, but instead just nodded. I actually haven't been there in a while. It's just getting too cold at night, she said sadly. Adrien didn't like her seeing her frown or even look slightly sad. Ah, the Paris weather has to ruin everything, he joked, just making her smile. It worked. Marinette laughed. Yeah, you're right. It's not bad without going there just to be alone. I can hang out on my balcony by myself if I want. I miss the ambiance of it, you know? She sighed and looked up into the distance. Probably looking back at the rooftop, he presumed. Hopefully when the weather gets warmer we can go back and watch movies late into the night, she said with a hopeful tone. Adrien's eyes nearly popped out. She wanted to watch movies? With him? On her personal rooftop? The admittedly flirtier Chat Noir side of him was itching to make some kind of joke, like, oh, late night movie night with Meow? Careful or you'll fall in love with me. Thankfully, he was much better at suppressing that side of him in his civilian form. You want to have a late night movie night with me? Yeah, mostly. He was mostly good at suppressing that side of him. Marinette smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind her ears. Yeah, I think it would be fun. Adrien smiled widely. Me too. Now all we have to do is wait for spring, he said, looking up at the sky. Come on, son. You can join us. We have plans depending on you, Marinette jokingly hollered up to the sky. What? We have to stay behind for 10 minutes and you both have already gone crazy and started talking to the atmosphere? A chuckling voice said. It was Alia, no surprise there. Adrien grinned, giving Nino a fist bump. Now that everyone was here, he could tell them about his father's change of heart. So, are you guys busy next weekend? This was another odd and new situation that wasn't totally unwelcome, but it was weird. It was incredibly weird for him. It had just been so long since Adrien had eaten a meal with his father. Having him come out of his designing room and out onto the table, it was jarring, much like Julika had said. He felt like he could barely focus on cutting into his pancakes because his father was right in front of him. Okay. Right in front of him was a bit of a stretch. Much like their dining table was. It was long, and there was a distance, but not as much as usual. Right now, he and his father were eating together, like a normal family. Adrien, how was your day at school? His father asked. Another strange and new thing. It was good, father, Adrien replied, feeling strangely awkward. He could feel Black juggling in his shirt, and Black was actually still in his room. It was like a ghost feeling or something. That is good to hear. What did you learn? His father continued. Adrien was slightly taken aback, but recovered quickly. Not a lot of things. AP Bio and Math were mostly just review for a test next week, and we had a sub in history, he explained. His father nodded. Are you diligent about your work? He asked. Adrien nodded. Yes, I am, he said. His father looked at him for a second. Good, he said stoically. Adrien drew in a breath, trying to work up the courage to tell his father that who he wanted to come for his birthday party. He had asked them at lunch, and whereas Ollie and Nina were free, Marinette was unfortunately unavailable. Instead, he had asked Julika if she wanted to come. He felt like he was actually closer to her than most of the other classmates nowadays. She seemed rather surprised by the offer, but accepted nonetheless. Father? Yes? I've decided on which one of my friends I wanted over for my birthday. Ollie and Nina and Julika, Adrien said. He held his breath, hoping that his father didn't regret the decision. There was a beat before his father nodded, and the metal click sounded that he was moving his utensil again. All right, let them know to come on Saturday at 11, he said. Adrien was pleasantly surprised, and didn't even bother to mask the big and kiddish grin that was on his face that would totally earn him teases and jabs from Plag, at least if he was here and saw. I mean, come on! He was allowed to have friends over, and have a birthday party. Of course he was beyond excited for that. And his father was becoming more active in his life and asked him about his day. Okay, sure, it was a bit strange, but it was a start. Late was better than never happening at all. Adrien took a bite of his pancakes. They seemed to taste sweeter than they were before. He wished this meal would never end. It was the start of something he'd always wanted since his mother passed away. He was finally going to have a relationship with his father again, and a real family. And that was all he wanted out of life.